Hello, I'm Esther Giduyuwat. Welcome to Africa 54. Here's what's coming up. The conflicts in Ukraine, Sudan and the Middle East dominate the discussions at the United Nations General Assembly meetings. 14 million Nigerian youths are using illegal drugs. It's one of the highest numbers in Africa. We'll have a report from Abuja on steps being taken to stem it. And early voting for the U.S. presidency in the state of Georgia shows a close contest between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. The war in Ukraine, Sudan's humanitarian crisis, and an escalation between Israel and Hezbollah are dominating the United Nations General Assembly meetings. VOA's UN correspondent Margaret Bashir has the details.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told the UN General Assembly on Wednesday that Russia has failed to subjugate Ukraine on the battlefield and is looking for new ways to break his country, including battering its energy infrastructure ahead of winter.
This is how Putin is preparing for winter, hoping to torment millions of Ukrainians, ordinary families, women, children, ordinary towns, ordinary villages. Putin wants to leave them in the dark and cold this winter, forcing Ukraine to suffer and surrender.
Separately, diplomats on the sidelines of the UN meetings are calling for calm after a wave of Israeli attacks and airstrikes on southern Lebanon and Hezbollah rockets launched at Israel.
In the Middle East, we're intensely engaged with a number of partners to de-escalate tensions in Lebanon and to work to get a ceasefire agreement that would have so many benefits for all concerned.
The UN said nearly 100,000 Lebanese had been displaced this week as they fled intense Israeli airstrikes, mostly in Hezbollah-controlled South Lebanon. Health officials said at least 51 Lebanese were killed and hundreds wounded on Wednesday. Israel said it shot down a Hezbollah missile aimed at Tel Aviv. At France's request, the UN Security Council met in an emergency session late Wednesday.
We must not, we cannot have a war in Lebanon. There cannot be a war in Lebanon. This is why we urge Israel to cease this escalation in Lebanon and for Hezbollah to cease the missile launch to Israel. We urge all of those who provide them with the means to do so to stop doing so.
Meanwhile, in Sudan, a brutal war between rival generals has pushed 26 million people into hunger and famine and displaced at least 10 million people.
We are all aware of the statistics, but let's remember, these numbers represent individuals, people filled with hopes, dreams, and aspiration. Aspiration for a flourishing, united, democratic Sudan. These numbers are me, my family, and friends.
At a meeting about the situation, the UN said it is trying to meet a massive funding gap for aid, dispersing $25 million from its emergency fund. The European Union announced nearly $77 million, and the U.S. said it is giving an additional $424 million.
We must compel, in fact, insist and demand that the warring parties accept humanitarian pauses in El Fasher, Khartoum, and other highly vulnerable areas to allow aid to flow and civilians to flee.
On Thursday, the General Assembly will hear from General Abdel Fattah el-Burhan, one of the protagonists in the Sudanese war.
For more on the United Nations General Assembly discussions, I'm joined by VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bashir. Margaret, how is Day 3 shaping up, and which African leader has spoken so far at the Assembly?
Hi, Esther. Yes, General Burhan just left the stage a few moments ago. He used the entirety of his speech to speak about his war with the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. He said that they should be designated as a terrorist group, that they are causing untold atrocities and war crimes in the country against civilians. It should also be noted that international rights groups have also accused the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, of carrying out atrocities as well. He said that he's willing to talk about peace, he wants peace, and he's willing to work with all groups that lay down their weapons. He also criticized regional states that have been supporting the RSF. He did not name the United Arab Emirates, but that is who the Sudanese Armed Forces blame for arming them. His ambassador at the United Nations often names them in Security Council meetings. The general himself did not, but he alluded to them. And then we also heard from the Kenyan president, William Ruto. He spoke quite a bit about the Kenyan troops that have deployed to Haiti and the Caribbean to help quell gang violence that is overtaking that island nation. They deployed about 400 police in June. He said that they're making progress. What was considered mission impossible is becoming mission possible. And he said he will deploy more troops in January, police in January to Haiti. It's been a bit controversial in Kenya. The highest court ruled on the deployment of police to Haiti. Haiti's transitional president also spoke. He thanked Kenya for their help, and he said that he's willing to consider as an option transferring this non-UN police force, this is called the Multinational Stabilization Force, into a UN peacekeeping force. Originally, Haiti was resistant to this idea because they've had bad experiences in the past with some peacekeeping missions, but they're willing to consider it now.
And Margaret, what are you learning about the war, the escalation of situation there between Israel and Lebanon, which also appears to be getting a lot of attention?
Yeah, last night there was an emergency meeting of the Security Council. As I mentioned in the package, the French foreign minister floated this idea of a 21-day temporary ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. Later, the White House came out and in a joint statement with President Macron calling for it. They were backed by a number of countries. So far, it hasn't received a great response or welcome in the region. The Israeli foreign minister has dismissed the idea of it, and Hezbollah is unlikely to embrace it. So still a lot of diplomacy going on in the margins of the General Assembly here this week to try and get some sort of stop to the fighting there, to the airstrikes.
Margaret,
and the rockets.
Right, Margaret, many thanks. We'll catch up tomorrow. VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bashir live for us from the United Nations. African leaders attending UNGA reiterating their demand for permanent representation on the UN Security Council. The U.S., one of 5 permanent members on the council, along with Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France, is expressing openness to having 2 African seats on the council without the veto power of the original permanent members.
I firmly reiterate on behalf of all African countries the request for the creation of 2 permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council for African nations.
It is imperative to safeguard and strengthen multilateralism as the only framework of action for international peace and security. This requires urgent reform of global institutions, including the Security Council, the IMF, and the World Bank, so that they are more inclusive and reflect the current geopolitical and economic reality. The African continent in particular must have a more important place in these decision-making bodies.
Namibia's interest in the Pact for Future is grounded in the understanding that multilateral institutions, including the Security Council of the United Nations, do not represent African needs and aspirations. The institution created in 1945 must better respond to today's challenges. At the core of the pact is this recognition and the urgency for profound global transformation. At the heart of our quest to rebuild trust in multilateralism is a legitimate demand to be recognized as equal partners.
For too long, the voices of those marginalized, those left behind, have been drowned out. They constitute the bulk of humanity. These are the voices of the poor, the displaced, the vulnerable. We cannot, in good conscience, leave them behind. They should be at the center of our discussions and our decisions. Africa, in particular, knows the cost of being left out. Yes, we're a continent rich in potential and resilient in the face of adversity, but we have also been disadvantaged by a global system that has generally treated us as an afterthought. We've been viewed merely as passive recipients of aid rather than as equal partners in global progress.
African leaders there seeking permanent UN Security Council status. The once thriving market in Omdurman, Sudan, is nearly destroyed by almost a year and a half of war. VOA gained rare access to the city and met residents who recalled its former glory as fighting continued to rage in the capital, Khartoum, on the opposite bank of the Nile. Henry Wilkins reports.
Omdurman Market, the shopping hub for the Khartoum metropolitan area, as seen in March 2023, full of people and full of life. Fast forward to September 2024, total devastation caused by almost 18 months of war in Sudan. Faris Mustafa fled the city when the war started. He's returning to the market for the first time.
In
the past, it wasn't easy to be here because of the overcrowding. All the shops were open. All the shops were filled with goods. All our mothers and sisters were here. I mean, the Sudanese community gathered here. Honestly, the war has changed us Sudanese. It's a test from God.
Since the war began in April 2023, the Sudanese government has barred entry to many international journalists. But in September, VOA gained rare access to Omdurman, which is now controlled by the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF. Gunfire and shelling can be heard directed towards positions in Khartoum, held by the opposing paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, less than 4 kilometers away. The owner of this cosmetics store declined to give his name out of fear for his safety. He says shopkeepers were getting ready for a major holiday when the war broke out.
All of the shops were affected. The shooting and chaos started around 2 days before the festival of Eid. People were operating normally and had their Eid products ready to sell.
A year and a half later, analysts say Sudan's war is at a stalemate. Peace talks have repeatedly stalled. Rights groups and the US government accuse both sides of war crimes. Just across the River Nile from here is RSF-controlled territory, which is inaccessible to most journalists. Those who have escaped say the destruction there is even worse. The UN says the territory is likely suffering from famine, the world's first in 7 years. But it's unable to confirm it due to lack of access. Mustafa says he just wants the war to end and life to return to normal for the people of Sudan.
May God compensate them, and people should not despair. God willing, one day we will return, and we will rebuild our country and rebuild Sudan, God willing.
Many civilians VOA spoke to shared this hope. Henry Wilkins, VOA News, Omdurman, Sudan.
Nigeria's National Drug Law Enforcement Agency says more than 14 million Nigerians, mostly youths, use illegal drugs. The drug trade in Nigeria is often fueled by the lack of legitimate economic opportunities. Timothy Obiezu has more from Abuja.
Precious Anselm is known as the voice for social change in his community in Kuje, a suburb of Abuja. A psychologist by training, Anselm has been spreading the word against the use of hard drugs here. He says his advocacy started 10 years ago.
It started out as a casual thing, youthful exuberance and all of those things. You have a handful of guys engaging in some of these things. Then over time, it just started becoming a pandemic. Most of them started graduating from the norm of cigarettes to weed, to inhalants and a whole lot of other things.
Anselm's advocacy was inspired by his encounter with drug abuse after he lost both his parents as a teenager. To survive at the time, he worked menial jobs and lived with chronic drug users.
There's no vice that you want to talk about that I wasn't exposed to. You get? I saw it all, but I was able to come out of it.
So far, he has helped about 100 youths from the community quit drugs, including 24-year-old Sarah Oyibowo. Years ago, Anselm convinced Sarah Oyibowo to leave her boyfriend, a chronic drug user, who was trying to introduce her to hard drugs.
It started getting to a problem because other girls were doing it, that they were friends, and he didn't want me to feel left out. And most times, whenever he takes it, he gets violent.
Nigeria has some of the highest numbers of drug users in Africa, according to the National Drug Law Enforcement Agency. With 14.3 million illegal drug users, Nigeria's drug prevalence rate stands at 15%, 3 times the global average. The country is also a hub for drug trafficking. Locally grown cannabis, cocaine, heroin, amphetamine-type stimulants are some of the most abused substances. The youth-friendly clinic in Kuje was founded in 2012 to help young people address drug-related issues and gender-based violence. Adeza Umaru is the program manager there. He explains part of the reasons why the prevalence rate of drug abuse in Nigeria remains high.
It's because we have a lot of peer influences and social vices that can, put young persons in positions where they will have to make radical decisions. Because look at what's happening in our economy. It is enough to make somebody make some kind of radical decisions.
Nigeria's National Drug Law Enforcement Agency is also trying to stave off the drug epidemic in the country by waging awareness campaigns to public places, including schools. Authorities are also arresting and charging drug traffickers. In May, Nigerian lawmakers put forward a bill imposing the death penalty on drug traffickers. But human rights groups, including Amnesty International, are criticizing it, citing the possibility of wrongly sentencing and executing some innocent people. In the meantime, Anselm says he will keep trying to make his community safer for young people. Timothy Obiezu, VOA News, Abuja, Nigeria.
Still to come, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump battle for every vote in the U.S. state of Georgia. We'll be right back.
The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in March of this year called on member states to eradicate sexual exploitation and abuse from the workplace, support victims, and hold perpetrators and their enablers to account. On this week's episode of Our Voices, we focus specifically on sexual harassment by hearing individuals' testimonies and examine research and analysis by African scholars on the subject of sexual harassment. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
In other news, South Africa has received the remains of 42 freedom fighters who died while exiled in Zimbabwe and Zambia during the struggle against white minority rule. The bodies were received Wednesday by government officials and family members at the Waterkloof Air Force Base in Pretoria. And the lawyer for Sudan's former autocratic president, Omar al-Bashir, says he has been transferred to a better-equipped hospital in the town of Merowe, 330 kilometers north of Khartoum. Al-Bashir suffers from age-related complications and high blood pressure, according to his lawyer. Polls show a close contest in the U.S. state of Georgia between Democrat Kamala Harris and Republican Donald Trump. VOA's Ken Faribault has more from Atlanta.
Georgia Governor Brian Kemp and vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance shared the stage at a recent dinner, a show of Republican Party unity after years of discord between Kemp and former President Donald Trump.
We're finna start all over.
Atlanta voter Dorothy Harp is not concerned about Trump's feud with Kemp over the 2020 election, which Trump falsely says he won in Georgia. She's more concerned about the economy.
We had lower prices on our food, gas, energy. Cost, everything was better under the Trump administration.
It's a message Harp takes door to door, encouraging members of her community to vote.
And I've got a lot of young voters who said they're going to vote for Trump.
In the 2020 election, Joe Biden defeated Trump in Georgia by just over 11,000 votes out of nearly 5 million cast. Numbers Georgia's Republican Governor Kemp knows well, as he implored audience members, including Harp, to vote.
So we cannot take anything for granted. We cannot take our foot off the gas.
Georgia is fully in play again.
Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens, a Democrat, says polls show another close race this year between Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris.
People sometimes get disenfranchised by thinking that their vote doesn't matter, but we have to go out there and make sure everyone knows that their vote does matter.
Listen, every vote counts.
Elijah Grace is with the voter advocacy organization, the New Georgia Project Action Fund, whose workers go door to door to promote voter registration.
We specialize in targeting black and brown people across the state, making sure that they have all the resources that's needed to cast their ballot.
A 2020 Pew Research Center study showed Georgia's eligible black voting population made up a third of the state's total electorate. Exit polls in 2020 showed 88% of black voters chose Biden, but recent polls show Democrats losing ground in this close contest.
Both sides understand that roads lead through Georgia.
When the race was between Biden and Trump, Grace noticed a lack of enthusiasm among potential voters.
And since the Democratic ticket has changed, we have seen a strong uptick in support for Vice President Kamala Harris.
She's at the intersection of color and gender.
Bernice King, daughter of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., believes Harris appeals to voters previously considering sitting on the sidelines.
Frankly, just speaking as a woman, I think this is a season where we're seeing more and more women emerge in the critical places of leadership.
Leadership is motivating Harp to back Trump, and she's working to bring others along with her as Republicans focus on inflation and cost of living concerns.
I have already committed to taking some of the people I know to the poll. I said, if you ain't got a way to get there, I'll get you there.
Polls open in Georgia for early voting on October 15th. Kane Fairbaugh, VOA News, Atlanta.
Zambian Sombo Muzata is an assistant professor of political science at James Madison University. She is here on a visa teaching public budgeting. She originally came to the U.S. in 2016 for her graduate studies. She spoke to VOA's Philip Alexiou about her experience and her view on this year's presidential election.
My name is Sombo Muzata, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at James Madison University, and I am originally from Zambia. I teach public budgeting to graduate level students in our MPA program. I am actually one of the two directors of the Master of Public Administration program. I'm responsible for student affairs. And I also teach economic and community development to both graduate students and undergraduate students. And I also teach a budgetary process class to our undergraduate students. I needed an extra set of hands. I promised the students I'll bring them copies of the Constitution today, because most of the times, layman conversations, when people think about a budget, they rarely think about politics. So students have to learn how budgets are prepared. other different processes for preparing budgets at the federal, state, and local levels. And because this is an election year, I've had to change parts of the syllabus significantly. So today, they analyzed the debates, and now we're trying to see, do the politicians think that this is important? And how did they speak about this? Good morning, everyone. How did they capture those important issues to the citizens in their debates? So that's what we're going to have today. When we see the presidential debates, the goal is what? To get into power, okay? So politics is about power. It's about making decisions, okay? Making decisions on who will get what it's allocation of resources, okay? Politicians tell us their priorities. And in this class, we sat a few weeks ago, and we listed what we think should be the priorities, okay? In our little, dialogues that we've been having over the last few weeks. So I'll meet you all on Tuesday, and have a restful weekend. Bye, see you next week. I think Zambians and most parts of the world, they hold the U.S. in very high esteem as a leader in democracy. And so my coming here to the U.S. and seeing the way elections play out through the cycles that I've been a part of now, sometimes I smile and sometimes I'm like, wait,
Taking this class has been really helpful for me, and also it's sort of influencing how I'm looking at the election and what the promises that are being made are going to be effective, because at the end of the day all these promises are going to need money to fund it. So learning from this class and seeing how it plays a role in the election it's been really helpful.
How are you? The U.S. can do better with its elections, and doing better with its elections, just probably focusing more on the debates. When we see the debates going down, I think the world expects a little bit more. We expect professionalism, respect, and being factual, and not being dismissive. So those are the small little things that we want to look at. I think the rest of the world sort of really thinks that the U.S. has it all figured out. But if you live in the U.S. and you watch the debates, then you go like, okay, so I don't really think this is all figured out. So I think the U.S. needs to rise back up, to the place where the world really holds it. U.S. elections are a big thing in Africa, in Zambia, and I think the rest of the world. Setting the tone for democracy, I think, to the whole world is basically what this is about. And sometimes I wish that the U.S. population and the U.S. leaders could recognize a little bit more of the role that they play on the global stage in terms of charting the whole conversation around democracy. So that's just what I think.
That was Sombo Muzata, an assistant professor of political science at James Madison University, and that does it for us today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. See you back here tomorrow.